seen he was from Dallas.
What business is it of yours? Where I'm from? Friendo?
The Coen brothers are certainly some of the most influential writers, directors of this particular generation. They've seemed to be able to move seamlessly between genre without losing the idiosyncrasies that make Coen brothers films, and that's an impressive feat in an era of homogenization in film. However, one aspect of their work that has been talked about 1,000 times, and is one of the staples of their talent and abilities, is their capacity for understanding, maintaining, and creating tension and suspense, especially when that potential manifests in the deepest of human emotions. But I'm going to talk about it once more. In the context of this, what makes this scene from No Country for Old Men so scary? Now, there's not a chance I'm going to go as far as calling this horror, and the Coen brothers are certainly not horror directors. But it's hard to argue that this scene isn't just as terrifying as something you'd get in a more dialogue-driven horror film. Now, Anton Chigurh is not a horror character, and he's certainly not running around like Michael Myers, Jason, or Freddy Krueger. But grounded in reality, it's arguable that he creates the same emotions. So let's delve deep into the mechanics of this now iconic coin flip scene and deconstruct just what makes it so scary. Released in 2007, No Country for Old Men is a minimalist neo-western based on the 2005 novel of the same name written by Cormac McCarthy. The film is a stripped-down, seething analysis and subversion of the tropes of classic westerns and crime stories, played out over the backdrop of 1980s West Texas. The film follows a group of characters who are all pitted against one another in a life-or-death game of cat and mouse. The scene in question here starts with an establishing shot of a Texaco gas station, located deep in the wilds of the Texas desert. If you've ever been to Texas, you know that in large stretches of Texas, there's essentially nothing. Take a drive from San Antonio to El Paso, you'll see a barren, flat landscape with nowhere to stop, and only the barren beauty of the sand to keep you company. Inside the Texaco, we see the proprietor who is framed against the window, with the bright Texas sun outside and smiley face stickers behind him, only to add to the character's innocence. That vast Texas landscape adding to that feeling of isolation and what we quickly realize might be vulnerability. Despite being day, the store is only dimly lit, with lots of shadow and contrast. There's only one key light on the proprietor and Chigurh from outside the window, increasing that ominous feeling. Credit Master Director of Photography and longtime Coen brothers collaborator Roger Deakins for that murky atmosphere. Initially, we see the proprietor as nonchalant, looking everywhere but up, oblivious to who is in his store. And so this starts as any normal, pointless, unimportant transaction would. Chigurh isn't there to rob the place, just to get some gas. Until this inquiry about the weather.
Y'all getting any rain up your way?
It's here that things shift. The most basic and innocuous past-the-time standard conversation starter inadvertently puts the gas station's owner in danger. Normally, conversation like this is light, quick, and meaningless. It's harmless. But Chigurh isn't harmless, and he doesn't see this as harmless. He's now suspicious of the proprietor. Chigurh's life governed by a hyper-specific code. This guy's now in the way. See, Chigurh's all about secrecy. He's a pragmatic killer who is careful with everything he does and tries to stay one step ahead of everyone else. In order to make sure he stays ahead, he utilizes violence to his advantage. And in Chigurh's eyes, this man, knowing he's from Dallas, might know too much. At least that's the prevailing theory. Chigurh is now sizing the proprietor up. We as the audience have already seen who Chigurh is, and we know what he's capable of. In the first 5 minutes of No Country, we are introduced to him and his remorseless way of dispatching people. The way in which he strangles his police officer is brutal. It's unsettling to see someone who is not beholden to social norms and laws, someone who can stand up in the middle of a police station and strangle an officer in broad daylight without hesitation. To add another layer of intensity to this particular moment, there's a level of self-gratification that washes over Anton Chigurh after his arresting officer takes his last breath, which tells us that this is a character who is not only compelled to kill, but actually enjoys it, at least to some degree. Every attempt for the proprietor to alleviate the situation just buries him deeper and deeper in this scene, especially knowing what we know about that last scene. Despite how nice the proprietor is, he is not exempt from Chigurh's violence. You can see the old man quickly realize Chigurh is dangerous, so all the niceties begin to fall away to that vulnerability we mentioned. At the same time, he's also just as quickly divulging information to a killer. The fact that he lives in the house in the back of the station, and that it's just him and his wife who live there, as the audience, you want to yell at the guy to stop talking. And part of that is because, like all their movies, the Coens do a great job of casting people who fit the region, but embody the Coen quirk. And unlike some other Coen brothers films, there's no bait and switch here. They're not going to make a hero out of this guy. This is who he is. He's a vulnerable old man who is outmatched on almost every level by this predator. This mismatch makes the audience feel so powerless and so helpless almost immediately, and creates, well, a sense of terror. Because you know what can happen. Murphy's Law, you're all but certain it will. This is a guy who Shiger has already identified as a man who has always done what he's told, never made ripples. As he puts it,
You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it.
Shiger knows who this man is in the game of life. You feel bad for the guy as a result, but Shiger does not see anyone as innocent. To him, this is all about fate, and this is where the coin toss comes in.
What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Sir?
The moment Anton flips the coin, we know what it's for. We know that this is life or death, and we know that because we have seen this character impulsively and brutally murder 2 people so far, the gas station attendant might be next. And he doesn't know this. He understands there may be danger, but he doesn't understand the gravity of that danger. Up until this moment, this has all been underplayed sonically. There's been no music. The coin just let the moment sit, but now there's the stirring of strings playing very low as Shiger tells him about the coin, heightening the tension, parlaying the importance of this toss. For Shiger, this is arbitrary. Life is either a yes or no, black or white, heads or tails. As long as you are living, you are bound to this coin toss. That's how Shiger makes sense of the world. All of this plays into a very real American anxiety, that violence could arise anywhere for something mundane, that life is bound by chance.
Call it.
Call it.
Yes.
For what?
Just call it.
There is a ritualistic feel to this, almost as if he's done this before. In fact, this whole scene is set up like a coin toss from the get-go. If we think of the counter as the coin itself, and Shiger and the gas station attendant as heads and tails, we can see the dichotomy between these 2 characters ebb and flow as Shiger decides between murdering this innocent man and, well, not. This coin started flipping the moment Shiger walked into the gas station, and now it has landed and a decision must be made. There's almost a mythological grandiosity to this coin toss, like a game the gods of Olympus would play with a mortal to demonstrate some type of philosophical point. It's a small moment, it's just 2 tiny words, but it feels enormous. And boom.
Well done.
Just like that, tension lifted. The tone of the entire scene changes the moment it's revealed that the man called the coin correctly, almost as if nothing ever happened. This is the Coen brothers releasing the audience. An audience has been held underwater for the last 4 minutes, finally getting a chance to breathe. He reprimands the man one final time for putting this coin of death into his pocket, which is just another example of this character's makeup, instructing him to keep the quarter as if it's some kind of trophy he'll never truly understand. The cost of this man's life potentially being worth 1 quarter from 1957, nothing more, nothing less.
Don't put it in your pocket, it's your lucky quarter.
Where do you want me to put it?
Anywhere not in your pocket. Or it'll get mixed in with the others and become just a coin.
And Shiger is off. This whole song and dance is, ironically, without song or dance. No intricate camera moves, no heavily stylized lighting choices, no score composed by an industry legend. The Coens show us here that those elements are not completely necessary to create something, well, terrifying in this case, but mostly something great, something important. The Coens are teaching something very, very, very simple here, which is strip down everything and make sure what you have is great and only add on if you need to. And if you need to, ask yourself, why do I need to? Because most of the time, the greatest moments in film, in art, and really any medium come down to the bare essentials of what makes that medium work, like we have here. Now that's not to say underlying beautiful moments in a film aren't amazing, or stylized lighting doesn't tell a story, but it's when those things are necessary that they elevate the moment. And it's when they're not that they distract from the moment, or worse yet, cover up a moment that maybe isn't all that good to begin with. So next time you're watching something or reading something, or really engaging with art in any medium, take a look at it. Take a look at it when it's not working and ask yourself, what about it isn't? Would it be better if something was taken away from it? Or better yet, watch when something is and ask yourself how adding something might make it better. If you can answer both of those questions in both of those moments, you will immediately be a better artist from then on out.
I'm the police! I run here! You just live here! King Kong ain't got on me!
Every story has a villain. They're essential to the enthralling narrative. Their archetype dates back to the beginning of humanity. And yet, some villains are so captivating, they demand to be center stage in our cultural memory. They live on well past their expected moment in the spotlight. Alonzo Harris's bravado, unique moral code, and imposing physical presence ensured that he would become iconic.
I walk a higher path, son. I can give you the keys to all the doors.
Training Day is a hard-hitting crime thriller that stars Denzel Washington as a corrupt cop Alonzo Harris and Ethan Hawke as rookie officer Jake Hoyt. The film follows these two narcotics officers over a 24-hour period in the gang-laden areas of West Lake MacArthur Park, Echo Park, and South Central Los Angeles. Written by David Ayer, known for gritty crime thrillers like End of Watch, Sabotage, and Street Kings, Training Day is a murky exploration of the corruption and decay within the LAPD's crash program. At the time of filming, the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums program was not widely known by the broader public. However, in 1997, in what is now referred to as the Rampart scandal, over $120 million in settlements and 140 civil lawsuits were brought against the program thanks to statements made by Officer Rafael Perez, detailing the unprovoked shootings, beatings, and planting of evidence. Ayer was taken by this idea of corruption exposed in broad daylight. He was surrounded by gangs and police violence as a young man, but rarely saw justice be served. He began to think, in a good faith situation, what would make someone reach these extreme measures in their quest for justice? Within that thinking, he developed the idea of Alonzo Harris, arguably one of the most reprehensible yet captivating characters put on screen in the last 2 decades. Do the ends justify the means is a question that has haunted people in positions of power for generations. And Ayer found that this age-old thought exercise was exactly the fulcrum by which to test his character.
Son, this is the game. I'm playing his ass. That's my job. That's your job.
Ayer also built the story in a way that was distinctly different to what was being produced in 2001. As opposed to making Alonzo out to be a straightforward villain, acting in opposition to our main characters, he's a mentor for a young and hungry would-be detective. He's an untrustworthy narrator, a dark threshold guardian. This unusual positioning within the story just goes to increase that intrigue and unexpectedness in the story overall. In his world, it's all one shade of gray. Whatever it takes to get the job done is permissible, said Ayer about Alonzo Harris's worldview. That was the core of Harris's motivation, a cop who viewed himself as the ultimate hero, who was willing to do the ultimate evil to bring forth the just results.
What? I said you protect the sheep by killing the motherfucking wolves. No, you didn't hear me.
In purely simple terms, Alonzo Harris is the villain, who says he's the hero, but deep down knows he's the villain. And Denzel's performance beautifully communicates these contradictions. His subtle, quiet moments and his bombastic, explosive unpredictability are the keys to making this character completely convincing. These twisting and turning motivations allow the character and the performer to subvert audience expectations. Alonzo Harris is played by one of the most famous and clean-cut leading men of a generation, Denzel Washington. And yet in this film, Denzel's off-screen persona works in favor of the character. We want to like him, even though he's obviously a disturbed person from the start. When we meet Harris in the film, as Jake Hoyt joins him on a ride-along, we think of Denzel as a good man. The movie is telling us how unstable Harris is, but we're predisposed to believe him as an honorable guy through the underworld. And then, when Alonzo Harris proves to be unpredictable, corrupt, and jealous, it's shocking.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
It's very bold of Denzel to take this role, said producer Jeffrey Silver. It is not his usual clearly heroic role. He usually plays someone the audience has a lot of empathy towards. This is a movie that changes that empathy. The crux of the story, and indeed Alonzo's character arc, revolves around a question of how far you should go to protect the innocent. Training Day is about someone with a god complex who views themselves as judge, jury, and executioner.
It can't be like this. It is this way, man. I'm sorry I exposed you to it, but it is. It's ugly, but it's necessary.
Alonzo's notions of might makes right are ideas that are linked directly to the axiom, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We see the brutal nature of Los Angeles as the film unfolds. We see Alonzo Harris being right about the way he chooses to interact with people in certain situations. However, we also see that he's bent the rules a few too many times, and he's fully lost his grip on what is just and morally right. And that's why it's only a matter of time until karmic justice catches up with him. All of these ideas dovetail into the scene in the middle of the movie where Harris shows the audience just how committed he is to his goals. and how they might have corrupted him. This scene starts as a seemingly standard educational moment, with Harris showing him the quality of the narcotics, pointing out inconsistencies, and teaching him how to spot it going forward. It quickly evolves into something else, though.
To be truly effective, a good narcotics agent must know and love narcotics.
Denzel's typical leading man persona causes the audience to push and pull against everything that's happening in this scene. Harris offers Hoyt the weed and then ratchets things into high gear when he demands that he smoke the weed.
If I was a dealer, you'd be dead by now, motherfucker. You turn down on the street and the chief brings your wife a crisply folded flag. What the is wrong with you?
Harris shows that this was a test, that he's playing mind games with Hoyt in order to see if he could actually handle what it's like to be an officer out in the wild. This thought exercise, while technically theoretical, is also still very dangerous. Alonzo Harris has a gun to Hoyt's head. Harris tells Hoyt to get out of the car and go back to the valley. He doesn't think he's capable of being a cop in the inner city of Los Angeles. Consumed by the desire to make detective, Hoyt lets the moment get the best of him and says,
Give me that thing. I'll smoke it, man. Give it to me.
Only here's where the truly terrifying side of Alonzo Harris comes out. Hoyt quickly realizes that what he smoked wasn't just your average recreational green. It was laced with PCP. Harris reacts to Hoyt's bewilderment with a distant sense of superiority. He's smug about his own ability to pull one over on his new rookie partner. He takes a perverse enjoyment out of what's happening to Hoyt. He frames his reaction to Hoyt as though he's helping him get prepared for the grimy realities of the street, but we all know he's just getting off on the sense of power he's wielding. And Denzel performs this layered scene amazingly well. If he leaned into the operatic nature of it too much, it would come across as cartoony. If he underplayed, it wouldn't be believable. But he strikes the right balance of intimidating, coiled, and perfectly calculated. It's a perfect marriage of character and performer. The bravado and pure ego of Alonzo Harris is on display even to the final moments of the character's life. He's looking death in the face and refusing to admit defeat. He's saying the same overly boisterous thing he's been saying and doing for the whole film, but there's a distinct air of desperation and futility to it now. The fact that the character knows he's going to die and chooses not to admit defeat is the moment that he transforms from an enrapturing character into one of the most memorable characters of the last 20 years. In that moment, you know that nothing is going to stop him. Literally nothing will change his ways. He's too far gone. He's not redeemable, and furthermore, he relishes in his own corruption because he doesn't view it as corruption. He views it as the right thing to do.
I'm gonna get that gun, and then I'm gonna get that money. I don't believe you got it in you, Jake. I'm gonna go get it right now.
Alonzo Harris is a truly terrifying character because he represents the legions of people from all walks of life that can be corrupted by the systems that they work within. He, as a narcotics detective, has power over a specific domain, and anyone who enters that place is going to suffer the consequences. The fact that he's not pure evil makes the character all the more compelling. He's a man who, at one point in time, was fueled by a righteous cause, but has lost his way. The unpredictability of the character, the charisma, and the anger that lurks within him make him as captivating to watch as he is horrifying. Ultimately, this role and performance propelled Denzel Washington to his second win at the Oscars. The film was so successful that it even spawned a TV series which ran for one season until the death of its co-star Bill Paxton in 2017. Currently, there are plans to make a prequel film centering on the young life of Alonzo Harris, to track his life through the underworld, and to expand the world of the original film. All of this success happened due to the fact that this story is airtight and features a character that is as charismatic as he is filled with contradictions. Denzel's performance and the perfectly executed narrative crescendo have transformed Alonzo Harris from a terrifying character to an Oscar-winning villain.
Boom! So you have come here for information. I have some for you. You're all going to die.
This might seem like a normal sequence from one of the highest grossing, most acclaimed fantasy epics of all time, but it's actually the reason for a rift between two of the film industry's most beloved professionals, Peter Jackson and Christopher Lee. One, a once-in-a-generation director with a long and very storied career. The other is one of the most iconic and celebrated actors ever. See, Jackson got to start making low-budget, avant-garde genre picks. Eventually, he would work his way up to the pinnacle of Hollywood filmmaking, while Lee, well, you might recognize him for his turns as either the immortal vampire Dracula or the Sith Lord in disguise, Count Dooku. However, film fans of a certain generation will undoubtedly pinpoint him as the dastardly white wizard Saruman in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies. Despite being a well-known actor by multiple era of film watchers, Christopher Lee, the man, was a very private individual, better known as Sir Christopher Frank Carradine Lee. So what happened here with Lord of the Rings, well, might surprise some people. See, Lee the person served in various military capacities, both the Finnish army and the English Air Force, prior to his career as a performer. In fact, he didn't even begin pursuing acting until he was about 40 years old. So what Lee did not anticipate, given not really being raised in the industry, is the gray areas of artistic collaboration. When making a movie, thousands of choices have to be made. Some as small as what color a character's jacket should be, others as large as whether a famous actor makes the final cut of a film, which is exactly what happened between Lee and Peter Jackson during the filming of Lord of the Rings. Christopher Lee was cast to play the iconic villain Saruman in the Lord of the Rings films. During the filming of the first two films, Lee and Jackson became quite close, according to, well, everyone around them. However, after the completion of The Two Towers, the filmmaking pair had a nasty falling out. Lee was incensed by what Jackson had done with his character in the climax of The Two Towers.
You were very cold about it.
I wasn't cold about it.
The 7-minute sequence was filmed in which Lee's character is ultimately defeated by the Fellowship and plunges to his death, becoming impaled on a spike of a dilapidated windmill. Despite the best of intentions from Jackson, running time for the sequence was deemed too long, which is ironic given the running time of the film. The sequence functions as a sneaky homage to one of the many deaths Lee's Dracula character suffered in his Hammer horror franchise 7-film run. This scene literally shows the death of the Fellowship's ultimate enemy. By the time the film saw theatrical release, however, this sequence was removed from that cut. At the time, Jackson said his intention was to have his reveal be the opening sequence of the next film in the series, The Return of the King. That was the explanation for the chopping of that scene on the cutting room floor. Jackson told Ain't It Cool News in 2003, the problem is the sequence was originally shot for The Two Towers, as it is in the book. Since The Two Towers couldn't sustain a 7-minute wrap-up after Helm's Deep, we thought it would be a good idea to save it for the beginning of Return of the King. Trouble is, when we reviewed various Return of the King cuts over the last few weeks, it felt like the first scene wrapping up last year's movie instead of starting a new one. We felt it got Return of the King off to an uncertain beginning since Saruman plays no role in the events. We don't have the Shire like the book does, yet we dwell in Isengard for quite a long time before the story kicked off. Well, Christopher Lee didn't like that, and this reasoning did not comfort him at all.
I can't do it, Peter. I'm sorry.
From Lee's perspective, this was a massive betrayal. Was it within Jackson's contractual rights to do this? Of course. But Lee was decidedly unhappy with how this omission affected the finished film. He initially didn't like the idea of the climax of his character's arc being featured in the beginning of another film, but then became accustomed to the idea. However, upon hearing that his Saruman scene had been cut from Return of the King as well, he got a little more upset.
You have elected the way of pain!
He felt The Two Towers lacked an ending, and that with Saruman's death being taken out of Return of the King, his character was sent off without the respect he deserved, both personally, artistically, and fictionally. We were shown the films in private, and when the third film came on, I couldn't believe what I saw.
Because I wasn't in it.
Christopher Lee told the University of College Dublin in 2011. It shows Saruman, the Fellowship's great mortal enemy, as the most evil of villains, on top of the tower, saying very nasty things to them, to Aragorn.
This exile crept from the shadows will never be crowned king.
The final confrontation between the Fellowship and that greatest enemy.
It wasn't in the film.
No one could understand it. There were millions of hits on the internet. They all said the same thing. What happened to Saruman? Buy the extended DVD. Well, that was ultimately the solution that Jackson and company had landed on. They realized they could utilize the footage of Saruman and his final confrontation for an extended edition DVD product that would make a bunch of money. This solution angered Christopher Lee even more.
Here we go.
He felt that this was choosing commerce over artistic integrity. He felt that this decision was motivated solely by the potential for financial windfall, as opposed to what the story and fiction required. Now, it's worth pointing out that for the most part, these decisions are actually made by studios, not Peter Jackson. Regardless, this is one of the most difficult aspects of producing work collaboratively. A director has to balance not only what is best for the movie, but the various egos and personalities around the people involved with the project. And that includes the people at the studios that never take a step on set. In some ways, that's just as challenging as telling a good story. Christopher Lee was so upset at the outcome that he boycotted the premiere of Return of the King. He and Jackson didn't speak for a number of years, Jackson even admitting that he knew that Lee was very upset. However, eventually the two men would come back together, and they did, nearly a decade later. Peter Jackson was helming an expanded version of The Hobbit, which was being fleshed out into a full trilogy of films, which, is a whole different can of worms about why we tell stories concisely. Jackson invited Lee back into the fold, offering him an opportunity to reprise his role. Lee accepted and appeared in the film as the iconic magician. Eventually, Jackson did say that he talked to Christopher about coming to the premiere, and he said, "Am I still in the movie?" And this time I could say yes. Lord of the Rings was a Herculean effort by all counts. The films took nearly a decade of Peter Jackson's life, thousands of people, and a combined $300 million. And to be fair to everyone involved, the one complaint lodged towards the Lord of the Rings theatrical cuts is that they were a little bloated, which is ironic given a lot of fans now love the extended cuts even more, which are 3.5 to 4 hours long. Studios just don't expect the average moviegoer to go see a 3-hour movie. There are exceptions to this rule, but The Lord of the Rings was a risk to begin with, financially, for the people in suits. Thankfully, Jackson and Lee were amicable and reunited their friendship after some time, but this is never an easy situation to deal with, to be sure. But it's one that many creative people find themselves in, and it's one that every creative person needs to look inside and prepare for, because if you're attempting to produce work on any scale, let alone $1 billion in a decade of your life, this will happen. And the other thing you can do is try to be respectful to all parties and do what's right for the work. Understand your vision and compromise as long as your vision remains what you see. Be true to what you believe in, maybe not true to extended cut DVD sales, but listen along the way. Other people are smart, they have good ideas. Vision isn't narrow when you work with people you respect, and that vision will become the collaborative part of the process.
Can you talk to these people or something? I'm not getting anywhere.
Oh, what are those?
Oh, well, it's cranberry juice, apple.
Really?
This is American Psycho, and it's still being watched today for a reason. Released in 2000, American Psycho is based on the controversial novel of the same name by Bret Easton Ellis. A dive into the narcissism, greed, and sociopathy present in 1980s yuppie culture, told from the perspective of Patrick Bateman in what would prove to be a breakout role for the then up-and-coming actor Christian Bale. It's a starkly naturalistic portrayal of what is essentially a psychopath. Bale is somehow able to seamlessly shift his performance from a charming, relaxed, and moderately self-obsessed stockbroker to a man in the throes of a violent and murderous rage in mere seconds, all while filtering these extremely nuanced emotions through a thin veil of narcissistic insanity.
I want to fit in.
So how was Bale able to breathe life into a character this extreme and have him still be at least relatively believable to the audience watching all of the carnage unfold? Back in '91, there was quite a bit of controversy surrounding the release of this particular novel. Simon & Schuster dropped the novel from its catalog at the last minute due to critical reception, eventually landing in the hands of Vintage Publishing. And despite all of the commotion, this reception did not hurt the book's sales, and the media attention ignited a high-stakes bidding war for the option rights. The film adaptation of the novel also had a bit of a rocky start, maybe fittingly, due to the very same controversial subject matter. For instance, despite being director Mary Herron's first choice, Christian Bale was not originally attached to play Patrick Bateman in the film. It was Leonardo DiCaprio who was originally attached in the role. DiCaprio's casting and Herron's subsequent displeasure over it led to the director being let go and the studio beginning a courting of Oliver Stone to replace her. At the time of American Psycho's pre-production, Leonardo DiCaprio was looking for a role to follow his performance in James Cameron's Titanic, and wanted to do something to ensure that he wouldn't get pigeonholed into playing romantic leads. Word began to circulate that DiCaprio was attached to the controversial project, and as rumor has it, this allegedly prompted a conversation between DiCaprio and journalist Gloria Steinem at a Yankees game where she persuaded him to drop out of the film due to the portrayal of violence against women. With the majority of DiCaprio's fanbase at the time being younger women after the Titanic role, DiCaprio agreed with Steinem and decided to drop out of the project. So, just like that, Christian Bale's back in. Which also meant that the film's original director would be back to helm once again. But the big hurdle remained of becoming this character for Christian Bale. Getting into that character, Patrick Bateman, was not an easy process either. And if you know anything about Christian Bale, some of this is going to come across as a bit obvious. When some actors get into shape for a role, it's to appear more physically intimidating on screen. With a character like Bateman, written as an indictment of the 80s version of what a perfect man should look like, his physical appearance was meant to be a walking satire of that culture. And to accurately portray this satire, Bale needed to adhere to a strict diet and workout regimen to maintain Bateman's meticulously crafted physique. Now, typically you hire a trainer and you you do what anybody else does. But Patrick Bateman was written as having a very specific workout routine in the film, complete with an ice mask, jumping rope, and an absolutely absurd amount of crunches. Well, that's just exactly the workout regimen that Christian Bale stuck to for the duration of the film's production. He is what's known as a method actor. Method acting is an attempt to become the character that you are playing on screen or on stage, whether the cameras are or not rolling, or whether there's butts in seats or not in seats. It was first conceptualized in the early 20th century by Russian theater practitioner Konstantin Stanislavski. Stanislavski's system is based entirely around an actor finding ways to experience parallel emotions to that of the characters they are portraying. Through these experiences, in theory, an actor can then exist in truth under the imaginary circumstances presented in their film or play. Since then, many instructors have extrapolated on Stanislavski's system. Lee Strasberg added more psychological elements to the system, Stella Adler's technique focuses more on the sociological elements of performance, and Sanford Meisner's approach is rooted in behavioral elements. All of them direct the performer toward the philosophy that acting is the reality of doing, which is the reasoning why someone like Christian Bale might stick to the exact workout regimen of his fictional character Patrick Bateman. Christian Bale wants to be able to experience the sort of self-obsessed, compulsive behavior that comes with being Patrick Bateman. During Bateman's confession in the film, naturally, Christian Bale couldn't have shot someone and hid from the police to generate the experience.
I killed Paul Allen with an axe in the face. His body is dissolving in a bathtub in Hell's Kitchen.
He did, however, utilize caffeine to stimulate his heart rate into one more akin to someone experiencing a heightened sense of distress by drinking a ton of espresso before the shoot. That kind of behavior is considered method.
Just had to kill a lot of people!
Now, I want to be really clear about something. There are a lot of people who believe in this industry that method acting is absurd. Actually makes things more difficult, doesn't lead most of the time to better performances, and can sometimes make film sets intolerable, even making other people uncomfortable to the point where it hinders their performances. For instance, it's widely known that Jim Carrey was an absolute nightmare on the set of Man on the Moon. He delayed shoots, refused to show up, relentlessly taunted Jerry Lawler, and would get into screaming matches with the director. Actions like these can create that needless tension on set and become more of an obstacle than a piece of productive performance. But in American Psycho, it seems to have been an example of it paying off. His performance is full of subtlety. Case in point, at around the 14-minute mark of the film, Patrick Bateman is at the dry cleaners trying to get the blood out of his sheets, where he runs into a coworker who delays him. As he's leaving, he drops his facade in a split second, and you see his face completely change as he walks out the door. These moments show an acute understanding of his character, but more importantly, an organic understanding of how his character would react. Within this toolset, observation becomes another tool that actors can keep in their belts when creating this character. Oftentimes, actors can hone in on small details that they observe in daily life and magnify them when bringing them into their work. In the case of American Psycho, Christian Bale studied an interview that David Letterman conducted with Tom Cruise. Bale said that Tom Cruise's overt friendliness and enthusiasm, paired with having almost nothing behind his eyes, was an energy that really resonated with him, and by tapping into that moment, that conversation, he was able to do a lot more with his character. A character that Christian Bale refused to drop even after the camera stopped rolling on set. And when this all synergizes properly, it becomes remarkable, even for the people around him. Multiple cast and crew members have said that Bale could make himself sweat on command during the fabled business card scene. And it wasn't a fluke either. Christian Bale was able to burst into perspiration at the exact time during every single take, every single time. This seemingly bionic ability to control an involuntary bodily function was a direct reaction to how deeply Bale had immersed himself in the character and the moment that Patrick Bateman found himself in. Cast and crew members would say it would seem that he was having a serious physical reaction every time the business card was trumped in the scene. And none of this works without smart, actorial decision-making skills. That's all acting is, right? Second-to-second decision-making, creating a character on the fly, like in the impromptu dancing, during the scene in which Bateman murders Paul Allen to Huey Lewis in the news, all of that being completely improvised on the spot by Christian Bale. And ironically, one of the most iconic scenes in the entire film. The moonwalking, the shoulder dips, all of this delightfully macabre whimsy Bale decides to bring to the scene, heightening the terror, all improv, all in the moment. Now, while this all might sound like an advertisement or infomercial for method acting, it's not. It is worth pointing out that American Psycho is not the classic it is today, is not even talked about today without Christian Bale's performance. And it's worth pointing out that how he got there was, well, through method. But that's not really the point. You could write this same piece about a litany of Christian Bale's roles. Instead, what I think is so interesting about Bale, American Psycho, method acting is, despite whether or not you agree with the technique, despite whether or not it works, and it clearly does at times and doesn't at others, one thing that is true objectively is that it requires a level of commitment to your craft, to your art, and to the moment that is not just admirable, but sometimes seemingly impossible to achieve.
Great honor to meet you, sir.
Harry tells me you're quite the science whiz. You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
The difference between a good movie and a great movie sometimes is just casting. The right actor paired with the right role can generate lightning in a bottle for a film production. It can reframe the entire context of a script. In the terms of most superhero movies, the whole film relies on the casting of the hero. However, sometimes, well, rarely, it might prove to be the opposite.
40,000 years of evolution and we barely even tapped the vastness of human potential.
In 2002's Spider-Man, Willem Dafoe delivers one of the most important performances of any superhero film in the last 20 years. But it's in the how that things get more interesting. Green Goblin first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man 14. Stan Lee originally intended the character to be a literal goblin unleashed by an archaeological dig in Egypt. However, Steve Ditko, not liking that idea, made him simply a man with gadgets and a flying glider who used the persona of a goblin to strike fear into people. As his appearances went on, it was revealed that he was actually Norman Osborn, the father of Peter's best friend Harry, and that he had taken a goblin formula in order to give himself super strength. Ultimately, Norman Osborn would prove to be a perennially popular character that would be almost as iconic as Spidey himself in some ways. When it came time for Sam Raimi and Sony to produce a Spider-Man feature film, it wasn't difficult for them to find their antagonist and their actor, Willem Dafoe.
I'm here.
If you can mentally travel back to the days of yesteryear when the superhero was right down there with the video game movie or the film adapted from a toy line. You had Dolph Lundgren as the Punisher, that Captain America movie with the son of the guy who wrote Catcher in the Rye, and Lou Ferrigno's Hulk. It was pretty slim pickings. What Raimi and company would create would not only launch the superhero boom that we still are in the midst of today, but create one of the most enduringly impressive adaptations of a comic book ever. Raimi's Spider-Man film is a near-perfect distillation of what works about the character and why he's so important. It's about choosing your destiny, about how the content of your character is the most important attribute anyone can have, about the weight of responsibility and the burden of power. It's the character piece created by someone who's obviously a die-hard fan, and that somehow made its way through the studio system. But a lot of it ticks to variables that aren't red and in spandex. Raimi's Spider-Man brilliantly executed the themes of what makes Spider-Man an ongoing title-level character. The struggle to balance personal life and a heroic one, the tensions of his role. While the film balanced these overlapping ideas beautifully, it really lives or dies on the shoulders of that antagonist. The phrase, "they always say a hero is only as good as his villain," comes into play here. When they first started discussing the role, Raimi gave Dafoe a copy of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He wanted to emphasize the duality of Norman Osborn, to really lean into the fact that while Spider-Man was attempting to make the right decisions, Norman had made one mistake, and it would define the rest of his life. After taking the experimental compound, Norman's goblin persona would forever be the one in charge of the show, and it would be up to Dafoe to make this tightrope act work. Like here, with Dafoe elegantly convincing the audience that there are two distinct personalities warring for control within his body.
You killed them. We killed them.
We?
Remember? Your little accident in the laboratory.
The technical dance of camera angles and mirror tricks could prove frustrating to another actor, but for Dafoe, it's obvious that he's in his element. He makes such minor decisions as an actor that when you call them out, they seem a little campy. He arches his eyebrows and lowers his voice whenever the Goblin is in control.
Godspeed, Spider-Man.
If you pay attention, whenever he's being possessed by the Goblin, Dafoe extends his neck just slightly and tilts his head down, almost talking through his arched eyebrows. It sounds like something that you'd instantly notice, but it comes off as relatively subtle. His Norman voice is also spoken a register higher than it normally would. It's all relatively impressive.
Performance enhancers. Bingo. Me. Your greatest creation.
Throughout the movie, he executes these operatic ideas in such a natural and grounded way that you instantly believe it. You never question for a moment these are choices being made by an actor, they just feel organic. And when asked about why he wanted to take on the challenge of Green Goblin, Dafoe himself said, "I wanted to do it very badly. It was competitive. I remember I was making a movie in Spain and they flew a casting director out to do a screen test in my hotel room. That's how I got the role. I had to fight for the role. My friends were like, really, you're going to do a cartoon movie? Some of them snobbed it, but I thought, no, it'll be cool. This is interesting. Movies from comics were not a normal thing. It felt like something new, and when you had Sam Raimi, he knew this material and loved this material. It was a double role. He understood what he was getting himself into, better than most actors at that time, and it comes across in his performance. You can feel his enthusiasm in every second of this film. Similar to how Tobey Maguire put on muscle for his role, Willem's wiry physique is as iconic today as it was in the 2000s. In many ways, the role is a dark reflection of Spider-Man's truth in the film. They both express themselves through their masks. Peter, who is a nerdy shelter kid, gets to be who he wishes he was when he dons the Spider-Man mask. He makes jokes, he's charming,
Cheese!
and knows exactly what to say in every moment, in every conversation. Goblin, on the other hand, uses his mask to shield himself from admonishment for his psychotic desires. He embraces the worst parts of himself because he's now free from judgment. And both Maguire and Dafoe play these roles excellently, which is no easy task considering Dafoe is acting through 4 inches of plastic for the majority of the time he's in the Goblin suit. And all of these things kind of dovetail into a moment like this. Climactic third act battle between Goblin and Spider-Man sees Norman completely overpower Peter until in a last push, Peter gains the upper hand. But just as he's about to deliver the final blow, the Goblin leaves Norman's mind, causing him to plead with Spider-Man for his life, which works on Peter, and then there's this.
The Goblin killed, I had nothing to do with it. Don't let him take me again. I beg you.
Don't let him take me again. This might be the best acting in any superhero movie due to its nuances. It's so apparent that for a split second it is Norman Osborn pleading for his life, and then mid-sentence the Goblin takes him. Dafoe's voice shifts, but then the Goblin tries to pretend to be Norman, and that's where the Goblin attempts to offer Peter what he's always wanted, a father.
I've been like a father to you. Be a son to me now.
Which leads to the perfect ending for a Spider-Man movie, better than really any other Spider-Man movie has even come close to accomplishing.
I have a father. His name was Ben Parker.
Perfect character work. And none of this would land half as well without Dafoe acting as the backbone for it all. Spider-Man functions much like the ancient myths of Greece and Rome. He acts as a way for contemporary audiences to grapple with ideas of self-determination and moral quagmires. Every ancient hero is judged against their foes. Where would Beowulf be without Grendel, Thor without Loki, Perseus without Medusa? The villains act as the impediment for our characters' growth. By overcoming them, our protagonist shows his strength and cunning. In Spider-Man's case, in some ways that becomes less important because it's Dafoe's menacing multi-tier performance that takes Sam Raimi's initial Spider-Man outing and transforms it into something much more interesting. And the point here is pretty black and white. It's not just casting is important, but every single bit of casting is important. Not just your hero, and not even just your villain. Everyone that opens their mouth, everyone that moves on your screen matters, and it's worth remembering that. A superhero movie in the early 2000s, late 90s could have lived and died by its hero, but Raimi and Sony understood something a little bit different, that it lives and dies by everyone. And in turn, it's not just Spider-Man that becomes so special.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up! Don't bully me, Daniel!
This is There Will Be Blood, the Oscar-winning 2007 film that cemented Paul Thomas Anderson and Daniel Day-Lewis as one of the greatest pairings of actor and director in the history of movies. This pivotal scene is the perfect example of what makes this slow-burn story such an epic tale, and it reaches its climax in a truly gruesome display of cruelty and inhumanity. Daniel Plainview transforms into a monster fueled by pure ego and rage. It's a cinematic masterclass in instilling fear in an audience, but would it have worked if Plainview was played by anyone other than Daniel Day-Lewis? There Will Be Blood is a loose adaptation of the Upton Sinclair novel Oil, which is a third-person investigative narrative centering on the fallout and background of the Harding administration's Teapot Dome scandal. Paul Thomas Anderson, the writer and director behind projects like Boogie Nights, Magnolia, and Punch Drunk Love, was living in England when he found the book at an antique bookshop. Feeling nostalgic for California, he began reading about the state's history and the widely cutthroat days of oil magnates. Anderson became obsessed with the idea of making a film set in this era. As he developed the story and began writing in earnest, the story evolved and shifted. He eventually retitled it There Will Be Blood. As he wrote, the only actor he could imagine pulling off the main character was the Oscar award-winning method performer, Daniel Day-Lewis.
I've abandoned my child. Say it louder. Say it louder. I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my boy!
Despite having never met him, Anderson attempted to tailor the part to Day-Lewis specifically. At the climax of the film, Paul Dano's Eli comes to visit Daniel Plainview to ask him for help. Up until this point, the whole film had been push and pull between Eli, who had been using his position in the church to accomplish his goals, and Plainview, a ruthless capitalist hell-bent on extracting as much money from the land Eli and his family had lived on for generations. Eli has fallen on hard times and wants to finally sell Plainview his land. Only, Daniel Plainview is one step ahead of him. He's been drilling the oil out of all the surrounding areas and siphoning out everything of value. He purposely left Eli's land dead and useless. The scene first starts out with Plainview coolly and calmly explaining these things to Eli. The joy and delight in his eyes is apparent. He relishes emotionally destroying Eli. The scene is subtle, and it has reversals and layers that are not immediately apparent, and that's what truly makes it so terrifying.
I am the third revelation. I told you I would eat you. We're family.
The performance Day-Lewis gives is like watching someone walk into quicksand. You know it's going to happen, and you spend the entire time hoping that they'll be able to escape, but you know they won't. Day-Lewis stated that his only goal with Plainview was an honest examination of a life. This agnosticism surrounding the objective atrocities that he commits in the film is why his performance is so disturbing. You feel a dispassionate removal of moral hierarchy from his actions. When analyzing the scene, you can see just how in tune the two performers are. They're genuinely experiencing this moment together. Paul Dano's movements through denial, anger, disbelief, and then a groveling acceptance and pleading for his life serve as the backbone to the scene. Without his amazingly understated and vital rhythms,
I am a false prophet. God is a superstition.
You don't get Day-Lewis's operatic evil having a genuine sense of reality.
That land has been had. Nothing you can do about it. It's gone. It's had.
If you would just take this lease, Daniel.
Drainage, Eli.
The fact that the scene quickly escalates to Plainview hurling insults, to outright bullying, to full-on attacking Eli could read as campy or over the top in a less skilled actor's hands, but Day-Lewis is in complete control of the scene, and the audience feels terror and exhilaration simultaneously as he revels in bullying Eli. Watching the scene is an experience all by itself. It steadily builds until Daniel Plainview begins hurling bowling balls at Eli. One of the balls hits a bucket of mop water, acting as an exclamation mark on the scene, and it all climaxes in Plainview grabbing a bowling pin and then brutally murdering Eli. It truly is unthinkable that anyone else could bring Plainview's animalistic intensity to life. It makes complete sense that Anderson was obsessed with the idea of Day-Lewis playing the collegiate and coiled businessman. Surprisingly, the co-creation of Daniel Plainview did not have much back-and-forth collaboration between the writer and director. Anderson was squirreled away writing, breathing life into the long-forgotten world of the early days of the oil rush. Day-Lewis was consumed with the idea of lending an air of verisimilitude to this objectively operatic and larger-than-life character. Contrary to what you might have assumed, much of the character development for Plainview was actually done by Day-Lewis by himself. He would call Anderson, ask a few questions, and then hang up. Their discussions were relatively brief, with Anderson giving Day-Lewis full control of the idea of Daniel Plainview. When asked about this process, Anderson said, "As far as I'm concerned, I didn't need to give him anything more than he wanted to know." That's not to say that Anderson wasn't involved at all. Obviously, his writing was essential to birthing this character. He had three sources of inspiration initially. Count Dracula was the first analog that Anderson thought about, and when looking at the finished movie, you can really feel that. The fact that Plainview is introduced shrouded completely by darkness, how he's literally and metaphorically insatiable, constantly trying to suck the blood out of the land and people around him. When asked about it, Anderson said, "I just had it in my head underneath it all that we were making a horror movie. Maybe we go to horror movies because we want to see something horrible happen. In the same way we might get excited to look at a car crash. In some ways, Plainview's story is a bit like a car crash, one that keeps just getting worse." The second component that made Plainview was J. Arnold Ross, the original character from Sinclair's book Oil. He and his son discover oil while hunting, and we follow them as they become embroiled deeper and deeper into the oil world. There Will Be Blood was adapted from roughly only the initial 150 pages of the book, and loosely at that. But still, J. Arnold Ross and his son Bunny serve as the sketched-out archetypes of Daniel and H.W. The third and arguably largest influence on Anderson's conception of Plainview was the real-life big oil magnate Edward Dehaney. Much of Plainview's in-film biography and exploits were based on this man. In fact, the final scene of the movie was filmed in Dehaney's former mansion. The animalistic ferocity and energy that Day-Lewis displays in the climactic scene is in stark contrast to the rest of the film. Plainview is a character that is defined by his calculating mind, staunch dedication, and unwavering determination. The film itself is a slow burn rumination on how far humanity will go to get what it wants. And this scene is the climax of that. Plainview harbors a myriad of emotions for Eli: resentment, anger, and pity, all of which glow through him in this scene. The scene is intimate yet simultaneously explosive, which is what really drives home how horrifying Plainview is. The whole movie, you've been waiting for him to reach his breaking point. Day-Lewis plays him as a man who's simultaneously barely in control of himself and constantly manipulating everyone around him. The audience has been waiting for him to lose control for the entirety of the 158-minute runtime, and when he does, it doesn't disappoint. It catapults the film into having one of the most memorable scenes in movie history. Ultimately, There Will Be Blood is a perfect example of what happens when a director and an actor join forces to create a perfect, terrifying performance. From the cold, shark-like behavior patterns of Daniel Plainview that were established by Anderson, to his deeply human motivations and broken soul that Day-Lewis so beautifully embodied. Both of these aspects of the persona we watch in the film dovetail into an amazingly complex and cutthroat character that left audiences around the globe enraptured and frightened to the bone. Daniel Plainview is so scary because we inherently understand his level of commitment and drive to achieve. He's ostensibly weaponized capitalism. He's the face of pure ambition. His mind is constantly scheming the demise of those around him. Part of it is words on the page, yes, but most of it is Day-Lewis's performance. It's his body language, the angularity of his posture. It's in his vocal delivery and in his trademark hat. There are some movies where the star is obviously in the picture as a means of furthering their brand or portraying a character in the hopes of finally getting that big award show nod. And while There Will Be Blood was critically very well received and went home with nominations for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor, nothing about this film feels calculated in order to make an awards run, which is probably why Day-Lewis ultimately went home with the Best Actor win. It feels like both Anderson and Day-Lewis were trying to create the most honest depiction of the character Daniel Plainview possible, no matter how horrifying the revelations they uncovered truly were.
I'm finished.
A crippled little rata. What a reputation to leave behind.
This is Gustavo Fring.
Please don't hurt my baby, please.
When we leave, you're not gonna go running to those police officers out front?
This is Todd Alquist.
Whoa! Damn, man, look at that, look!
And this is Tuco Salamanca. There really isn't a primary antagonist to Breaking Bad, but you could definitely argue some characters are presented as the villains of the series. And it really boils down to which characters are able to demonstrate the highest levels of humanity despite their inherent sociopathic tendencies. When we see psychopaths and sociopaths in film and television, we're often as fascinated by them as we are terrified. Vince Gilligan taps into this seemingly fear-driven intrigue we all share, digs deep into the human psyche surrounding these personality disorders, and then utilizes it to create some of the most tense scenarios ever to grace a television screen. He writes Tuco as this terrifyingly violent and unpredictable sociopath, Gustavo Fring as a calm and calculated psychopath, and Todd as about as close to a purely evil psychopath as you can get without turning him into a serial killer. They are all horrible, reprehensible, and outright terrifying, but some of these characters are worse than others. And it takes an understanding of how Vince Gilligan applies his knowledge of psychology to these characters to really tell the difference. Breaking Bad began airing in 2008, and unlike most television shows that slowly lose their audience as time goes on, Breaking Bad consistently gained an audience. This culminated in the show's final episode, which actually beat out the NFL in ratings for that night, as 10.3 million viewers tuned in to watch the fate of Walter White unfold on September 29th, 2013. One of the reasons Breaking Bad was able to accumulate such a massive following was the relatability and realism with which Vince Gilligan was able to write these incredibly disparate and intricate characters. Every time he seeks to create an emotionally evocative moment, Gilligan delivers with pinpoint accuracy. As viewers, we feel the desperation and intensity of our main characters propped up right alongside the fear and chaos instilled by the show's seemingly antagonistic secondary characters. This is largely due to Vince Gilligan's ability to understand how human beings operate.
I don't think we're alike at all, Mr. White. You are not a cautious man at all. You have poor judgment.
We aren't going to attempt to deconstruct the entirety of antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD for short, but there are a few subtle differences between psychopaths and sociopaths that we are going to briefly touch on. Individually, psychopathy and sociopathy are not diagnosable conditions. However, both fit into the diagnostic criteria to meet ASPD. While it is true that all psychopaths are sociopaths, not all sociopaths demonstrate psychosis. Psychopathy is described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as a lack of anxiety or fear and by a bold interpersonal style that may mask maladaptive behaviors. Whereas a sociopath is more impulsive and volatile. A true psychopath is someone that is not only an excellent manipulator, but is also able to disguise themselves as being completely normal. Sociopaths will behave with reckless abandon, as they do not really care about the consequences of their actions, whereas a psychopath is fully aware of everything going on around them at any given moment in time. We see these types of characters frequently in the Breaking Bad universe. The first of these big secondary characters we are introduced to is Tuco Salamanca, and it's quite the introduction.
Ah, tight, yeah! Ah, blue, yellow, pink. Whatever, man, just keep bringing me that.
In the 6th episode of Season 1 titled Crazy Handful of Nothing, Tuco spends the majority of his introduction beating Jesse Pinkman into a medically induced coma just to prove a point. This cements him in our minds as being an unpredictably dangerous sociopath. Tuco Salamanca is chaos dialed up to 11, and it's the first time Walt is introduced to the dangers of dealing with a cartel. With Tuco, Vince Gilligan utilizes not only sociopathy, but also a somewhat rare mental disorder called intermittent explosive disorder, which is defined as recurrent behavioral outbursts representing a failure to control aggressive impulses. Gilligan created a character that can turn from your friendly neighborhood methamphetamine wholesaler into a bloodthirsty nutcase at the drop of a dime, and is very reminiscent of Joe Pesci's early 90s mobster characters.
Heisenberg says, relax. Orale, Holmes. I'm relaxed.
He even goes as far as to insult a man who is dying from one of his beatings. All of this unpredictability and rage puts us as viewers on the edge of our seat whenever Tuco is on the screen. Tuco uses violence to gain his power, and through his character, we are effectively able to be introduced to the idea that our main character is entering a ruthless and brutal world where only the strong survive. Tuco was actually supposed to be a much larger part of Breaking Bad's 2nd season. He was offered an 8-episode arc, but after some discussion, Raymond Cruz requested that his character be killed off, mostly because he found the role extremely difficult to play and was coming home from 14-hour shoots not wanting to speak to anyone. This prompted Vince Gilligan to create a new antagonist for Walt and Jesse. Only this time, he'd swing the ASPD pendulum into the realm of true psychopathy. He would create a character who was terrifying through a veneer of cold, calm, and quiet calculation in Gustavo Fring.
I have invited you into my home so we could sit and talk, discuss what's going on in this business. Our business, like men.
Where Tuco intimidates us with violence, Gustavo Fring intimidates us with silence. One of the ways a person can achieve power in a situation is to always say less than necessary. And that's exactly how Gustavo Fring operates. We're afraid of him because we don't even understand who he is. In the Season 2 episode 11 titled Mandala, Gustavo Fring is originally seen as what appears to be an extra, just helping out his employees during a busy lunch shift. Once we finally get to this somewhat impromptu meeting between Gus Fring and Walter White, we see him for who he is, an incredibly intelligent, cautious, and informed drug dealer.
I have to ask, why?
There's a subtlety to his character in the sense that, at first, we only catch glimpses of his more sinister nature. He hides behind this plastic smile of a humble restaurant owner, but even in this first scene, we see him drop his facade for a few brief and terrifying seconds. For the most part, Gustavo Fring uses intimidation to maintain his power. Gus Fring terrifies us because of how far he thinks ahead. He orders the murder of Don Bolsa in his own home in an effort to consolidate power. He has an army of foot soldiers at his command who will do his every bidding. However, this isn't where Gustavo Fring is at his most terrifying. It's actually where he is the most comfortable. Where Gustavo Fring is the most terrifying is when he takes matters into his own hands. When he drops the facade and reveals this inner demon who has no loyalties to anyone outside of his own business. He murders his right-hand man in front of Walt and Jesse with a box cutter, just because he is angry. He tells Walt that he has no problem murdering his infant daughter. Even the moments where Gustavo Fring demonstrates kindness and reason are all done as either a manipulation or as a means to an end. Nothing matters to Gustavo Fring more than money and power. He is a one-man masterclass on the intelligence and intimidation necessary to maintain that power at all costs.
I will kill your wife. I will kill your son. I will kill your infant daughter.
Perhaps the most unsettling psychopath in the Breaking Bad universe lies within the character of Todd Alquist.
That dude? Whack job!
Let's just stick to the facts here.
Facts? Oh, okay. How about the fact that he shot a kid?
Todd is introduced to us as just this kind of seemingly polite pest control worker.
There's a nanny cam in the living room clock. I disabled it. I just thought you should know.
However, that facade is quickly dropped in the episode titled Dead Freight, in which Todd not only murders an innocent child without hesitation, he takes a trophy with him. He keeps the kid Spider. This is the same mentality hunters apply to wild game. Taking an innocent life is almost like a sport to him.
Shit happens, huh?
Todd Alquist isn't the most violent or calculated character on the show, but that is what makes him so terrifying. There's a pleasure that he derives from torturing and killing people that takes his character beyond being just a psychopath. Todd Alquist is pure evil. He seems to really enjoy the gradual psychological breakdown of Jesse Pinkman, offering him glimpses of hope, only to have those dreams dashed violently and dramatically. These moments were extrapolated upon in the film El Camino, where we really see Todd reveling in his torturous nature and just how much damage he did to Jesse Pinkman. Where Tuco Salamanca kills to intimidate and Gustavo Fring kills for power, Todd Alquist kills because he enjoys it. He doesn't have any lofty financial goals or aspirations to become head of a crime family. He just exists to kill, torture, and cause harm, which makes him the most inhuman character of these three.
Well, at the end of the day, it was him or us, and I chose us. And I would do it again.
He is a true narcissistic nihilist. He cares for nothing. He exists for nothing. He believes in nothing. This makes him almost completely impossible to track as a character. We can't predict any of his behaviors because we have no idea as to what actually drives him. He isn't the strongest. He isn't the smartest. He is chaos incarnate and reminds us that sometimes people don't have to have explanations for what they do. Sometimes people are just bad.
And then out of nowhere, Todd pulls out a gun and shoots the kid.
This is Todd Alquist we're talking about? He killed Drew Sharp?
Like it was nothing.
With Breaking Bad and the surrounding universe, Vince Gilligan draws us in time and time again, with characters that represent some of the more fringe elements of human psychology, and pitting them against the pursuit of money, power, and control. The absence of humanity presented within these characters reminds us what it means to be a person, and how important empathy and compassion are in our day-to-day lives. Without empathy, human interaction becomes cold, unnerving, and cutthroat. A good writer will dig deep into the psychology of their characters to bring them to life and utilize the unpredictable nature of the human mind to drive the desired tension they seek to create.
He needs an ambulance. He needs a hospital. Do something. You're smart, right? Do that thing.
These characters all have us, as viewers, invested in their individual stories. Each one of Gilligan's characters could be viewed as an essay of not only various psychological conditions, but also how these conditions developed and shaped these characters over time. When we approach character mentalities with honor and respect for the psychology behind them, we create characters that instantly deliver the intended message with pinpoint accuracy. Vince Gilligan understands psychology. He understands the subtle differences between sociopathy and psychopathy. And he understands how to play with all the variables in between.
Now, are you a rusher? Or are you a dragger? Or are you gonna be on my time?
I'm gonna be on your time.
This is Terence Fletcher. In this film, J.K. Simmons delivers an Oscar-winning performance as the sadistic conductor of the prestigious Schaefer Conservatory's competing studio band in New York City. Terence Fletcher is highly intelligent and violently manipulative, utilizing an array of draconian tactics like exaggeration, triangulation, and humiliation to erode the psyche of his eager and naive students in effort to bend them to his will. He then justifies these behaviors as coming off as a man who is just trying to get the best out of his students, explaining it away with an inflated rumor about two famous jazz musicians. Terence Fletcher is representative of the horrors that can occur when a malignant abuser finds himself in a position of power and left unchecked.
If I ever find one of these lying around again, I swear to God, I will stop being so polite. Get the out of my sight before I demolish you.
Whiplash is a 2014 Oscar-winning drama starring Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons. Written and directed by Damien Chazelle, the film follows an ambitious young music student, Andrew Neiman, as he navigates the inherent pressures of working his way up the ladder as a drummer at New York's most competitive music academy. He eventually ends up under the instruction of the conductor of the school's competing studio band, Terence Fletcher, a teacher who goes to an extreme length to get the most out of his students. Student-teacher relationships are a crucial part of our development as human beings. Outside of our immediate family, our teachers can be some of the most influential people in our lives. This is what makes films like Dead Poets Society and School of Rock so impactful. The student-teacher relationship is something that we all connect with on a personal level. This is even more true when you think about higher education. As young students begin to hone in on what it is they want to contribute to in this world, they rely on the instruction and advice of their professor to guide them into their careers. In Whiplash, the character of Andrew Neiman wants greatness, and he wants to become the next Buddy Rich. And all these wants, drives, and skills are set up perfectly during the film's opening scene. We can see his focus and determination. We see his passion. When Fletcher enters the room, he uses the phrase,
"You know who I am?"
We understand that Terence Fletcher is at the top of some sort of power structure within the confines of Schaefer Academy, and that, whoever he is, it's important for Andrew to impress him. This is where Terence Fletcher's manipulation of Andrew Neiman begins. Abusers who are good at what they do spend an inordinate amount of time figuring out what people want before embarking on their quest to bend them to their will. When you put these people into an environment like a music school, these abusers no longer have to do any work whatsoever in figuring out what people desire. Just the fact that Andrew Neiman was accepted into the Schaefer Academy of Music tells someone like Terence Fletcher everything they need to know about what this student actually wants. The fact that this kid is up late practicing on drums tells Fletcher that he is willing to do whatever it takes to succeed at what he does. And those two things add up to something incredibly exploitable. The thing that makes Terence Fletcher so terrifying to us as viewers is that he seems to have a purpose for being so terrible. Everything Terence Fletcher does in this film is a performance centered around one thing and one thing only: manipulating his students into delivering the best performance possible. When Terence Fletcher finally invites Neiman to join the studio band, he tells him to show up to rehearsal at 6 a.m. when the rehearsal didn't even start until 9 a.m. Fletcher doesn't even care as to whether or not Neiman is there at 6 a.m. or not, but Neiman does. This is an early opening move in Fletcher's attempts to bend Neiman to his will. During this initial rehearsal scene, we catch our first glimpse of Terence Fletcher's abusive tactics when he intimidates a student into a false confession of being out of tune. After humiliating the student and kicking him out of the band, Fletcher then reveals that not knowing whether or not you are out of tune is an even bigger problem.
For the record, Metz wasn't out of tune. You were, Erickson. But he didn't know, and that's bad enough.
This is the Music Academy equivalent to a public execution, the one in which an innocent victim was punished for something he didn't even really do in the first place. This entire situation feels like one of Terence Fletcher's ways of establishing his dominance over Neiman before putting him on the drums to see what he can do. During a break, Fletcher approaches Neiman and starts casually probing him about his personal life. This all seems very pleasant, but he's really just utilizing charm to disarm Neiman. This is another abusive tactic known as love bombing, in which an abuser attempts to influence a person through demonstrations of attention or affection. There's a key moment in this dialogue in which Terence Fletcher asks Neiman,
"Parents musicians?"
No.
What do they do?
From the outside, it seems like Fletcher is asking this so he can throw it back in his face later. But this question is really the moment in which Fletcher realizes that he can do whatever he wants to Andrew Neiman. Without any ties to the music industry, Fletcher understands that Neiman is reliant on his approval alone to achieve what he wants, thus opening the door for Fletcher to basically operate from a position of total authority over his career trajectory. Once Neiman gets onto the drum set, Fletcher continues the seemingly supportive persona that he adopted in the hallway. He even goes so far as to call Neiman Buddy Rich. If you recall the opening scene of the film, Neiman has a picture of Buddy Rich on the wall of his rehearsal space. This is Fletcher appealing to Neiman's drive and motivation before completely tearing it away. During some of Neiman's drum fills, Fletcher stops him and begins informing him that he is not drumming at the tempo he wants him to play.
Little trouble there.
This is where the tactic of withdrawing comes into play. The emotional high Neiman received from Fletcher validating him in the hallway is slowly being replaced with disappointment. And inside a human mind, this tactic causes chemical reactions akin to coming down from a really potent drug. Fletcher then begins moving the goalposts back and forth for Neiman, creating an unreachable target. This is an extremely concentrated version of yet another manipulation tactic called crazy making, the goal of which is to make the victim doubt their own abilities and/or sanity, so that you can further warp their view of the world later on. Creating this impossible tempo to reach frustrates and terrifies Neiman, who at this point is just a sweet kid trying his hardest to impress his instructor. This continues back and forth until a physical threat presents itself.
Why do you suppose I just hurled a chair at your head, Neiman?
Neiman supposes it's the tempo. This is Fletcher basically screaming, "Look what you made me do," at someone he is currently abusing. A now stunned Neiman begins to flounder over his speech, sweat, and become completely and utterly nerve-wracked, and this is where Fletcher goes in for the kill and begins physically assaulting Neiman in front of the entire ensemble. This 50-year-old man is literally beating his tempo into this 19-year-old psyche while screaming in his face. Humiliation is the next tactic Fletcher uses to break Neiman, and when he finally begins crying, Fletcher knows that he has succeeded at what he intended to do in the first place, which was to completely and utterly break his student down to tears and then embarrass him in front of the entire ensemble before removing him from the drums. He is stripping Neiman of his humanity in an effort to mold him into the type of musician he wants him to be, which was the goal from the moment he announced he'd be placing him on the drums in the first place. Neiman is completely and utterly broken, and the next time we see him, he is practicing the drums until his hands literally bleed. If you delve deep enough into any artistic or athletic pursuit, you will find some fringe mentalities on how arts and athletics should be approached. There seemed to be a theme of needing to suffer greatly in order to generate a desired outcome in performance. The no pain, no gain mentality has been passed down onto generations for centuries, and the idea that in order to achieve greatness, a person must be broken down and stripped of all their dignity before proceeding with their career trajectory is not unheard of. While Whiplash takes this mentality to extreme and brutal levels, Damien Chazelle is trying to show us that these tactics have a lasting impact on a young and fragile psyche. He's telling us that these practices can begin to erode someone's self-perception and cause immense harm in just a few small moments. After Terence Fletcher's assault, we then observe Andrew Neiman's downward spiral into a pattern of unhealthy behaviors that end up alienating him from his family, friends, and romantic pursuits throughout the movie. All of that is born from his introductory scene in the studio band's rehearsal room. He triangulates Neiman again by bringing another drummer in to compete for his spot on the band, forcing 3 different drummers to play for countless hours until the studio drum set is soaked in blood. He imbues Andrew Neiman with so much pressure, anxiety, and toxicity that at one point he leaves the scene of a serious car accident in which he was severely injured just to make it to a performance on time. Terence Fletcher is a truly terrifying character. He is a sadistic perfectionist, hell-bent on using verbal, mental, and physical abuse on young adults to force them into doing exactly what he wants. J.K. Simmons delivers a performance that is rich with subtleties, and the choices he makes in bringing Terence Fletcher to life are uncanny. In the hands of a lesser performer, Terence Fletcher could come off as seemingly stereotypical, but the more you observe the nuanced layers Simmons brings to life through his eye movements and facial tics, the more you discover. You begin to see the inner workings of a victimizing maniac play out through the veneer of a passionate teacher. In the mind of Terence Fletcher, all of his abuses and manipulations are justified because he's trying to inspire greatness, and there's nothing more terrifying than a narcissistic sociopath driven by a warped sense of purpose sitting in a position of power.
I think he's dead. Good guess. You killed him?
No, I shot him. Bullets in the fall killed him.
This single statement delivered with commanding morale exemplifies the most terrifying aspect of Tom Cruise's character, Vincent's philosophy. An absolute manipulation of truth that lets the audience know the next hour and 40 minutes will be bent to this man's will. But what is it that bends us as well? What makes Vincent one of the most horrifying villains in film history? Released in 2004, Collateral was a neo-noir film steeped in the night of Los Angeles, directed by Michael Mann. Starring Jamie Foxx as our protagonist Max, a taxi driver with dreams of starting his own business, and Tom Cruise's Vincent as one of cinema's most manipulative and cold villains, a hitman charming as he is lethal. Collateral's plot is classic bare-bones pulp. Vincent is in Los Angeles under contract to assassinate 5 witnesses, and enlists Max to unknowingly drive him to each murder. After the first goes awry, the night spirals into abrupt violence and controlled mayhem. And controlling that chaos is Vincent. His charm is almost enviable in its confidence. Dressed in a simple gray suit with well-kempt gray hair, he says things so matter-of-factly, with such an air of authority that you almost can't help but to agree.
Now we gotta make the best of it. Improvise, adapt to the environment, Darwin, shit happens, I Ching, whatever, man, we gotta roll with it.
When Vincent explains his disdain for LA and larger cities in general, there's an odd sense of warmth. His dislike for the beloved metropolitan stems from a lack of human interaction.
17 million people. This is going to be the 5th biggest economy in the world, and nobody knows each other.
Even going so far as to tell a story about a corpse riding unnoticed on a train for an entire night. To Vincent, this perfectly represents the humanity he has built in his mind, one that is indifferent and cold, self-absorbed in his own existence. And Cruise sells it so well. He looks out of the taxi's window to hundreds of city lights framed by man and cinematographer Dion Beebe, with equal parts disgust and yearning for something that might be just beyond the skyline. It's here we're given our first glimpse of how Vincent eases his way in and begins to chip away at our defenses. The ability to make us not only trust him, but wonder how we ever believed differently in the first place. It's a common manipulation technique. He quickly establishes himself as the authority and continuously demonstrates his power. Sometimes it appears to be in the benefit of Max, but the end is always to further his own wants and desires. When Max's boss radios to ask about the taxi's cracked windshield, damage caused by Vincent, Max is threatened with being held financially accountable. Vincent overhears and aggressively jumps in to defend the cabbie.
You know goddamn well your collision policy and general liability umbrella will cover the damages. Now what are you trying to pull, you sarcastic prick?
It's a bit of wish fulfillment on both Max's and our part, the confident and intelligent alpha who tells our boss off. But all this is really just to further his own needs. It isn't so much a want to help as it is a circumstance slowing him down. But for Max, it feels good. Almost good enough to make him wish that he was that strong. And Vincent exploits that want. When he first meets Max, he immediately begins to size the cabbie up. Max continuously says bigger things are on his horizon.
I'm not in this for the long haul. Just filling in. It's temporary while I'm getting some things shaped up. This is just temporary.
But quickly changes the subject when asked about a romantic interaction. To Vincent, these are signs of weakness, something to be exploited and used for his benefit. And everything that happens throughout this movie is at the will of Vincent. In one of the film's more intense scenes, Vincent takes Max out for a drink at a jazz club, even after Max admits to not liking jazz. As the two watch the trumpet player on stage, Vincent again turns the experience into a reason to monologue about how he sees life. He waxes philosophical about the way jazz is all improvisation, adaptation with disregard to structure and melody while moving within the music. After the trumpet player joins them and tells a story about meeting Miles Davis, one point sticks out particularly to Vincent. Hearing that Miles Davis stayed in the zone, that he was not able to be spoken to or bothered while he was working, and with Vincent looking at the actor like he's the only one in the world, he seems enraptured in the story. When it's revealed that the trumpet player is next on Vincent's list, Max tries desperately to talk Vincent out of the kill only to be silenced and told by Vincent, "I'm working." That concise, perfect, plain-spoken line immediately sends shivers down the audience's spine. And we make the connection. If this character has spent that much time doing something so evil, how many lives has he destroyed? It's here we see Vincent at his most villainous, a disconnect between any sort of personal feeling and what he does for work. These murders, these crimes are all a means to an end. This sort of single-mindedness runs throughout film's history. From Anton Chigurh, Hannibal Lecter, or even Dracula, it's a disconnect between our villain and humanity. The moral empathy we believe or hope lies in everyone. When we're presented with that lack of empathy, it breaks our hearts and haunts us all at once. That disconnect is directly tied to the heart of what keeps terrifying us about Vincent more than a decade later. One of the filming's happiest accidents led us to one of the most profound visual metaphors. Mann had stated that the crew came across the coyotes while filming. He instantly knew this was a perfect moment to capture. It was almost like LA itself offered one more moment to show Vincent as he was, a predator hunting the gritty asphalt because it's in his nature. The LA Man Presents is gritty, haunted, maybe a direct retaliation to the glitz and glamour most see. The LA here is the darkest bits of Bukowski, where Tom waits, a city that has survived and endured. As we watch Vincent navigate its dark alleys and dimly lit streets, we know he's adapted himself to not just endure, but conquer. We learn his justification and coldness has taken him this far. His terrifying logic, broken down so simply it sounds almost bulletproof. As the two drive toward the second hit, Vincent begins the first of many arguments and rationalizations about humanity's engagement with death and murder. Why should a death in your direct proximity, even one against the hood of your car, be more impactful than the death of thousands occurring every day in a war-torn country?
Have you ever heard of Rwanda?
Yes, I know Rwanda.
Tens of thousands killed before sundown. Nobody's killed people that fast since Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Did you bat an eye, Max? What?
It's cold and terrifying to see life reduced down to numbers, but the real world's villains always have. With Vincent, even those single deaths are just a means to an end. That sort of twisted rationalization is so horrifying because we know it's not alien or fantastical. Vincent isn't a metaphor or creature from folklore, he's a fictional representation of the darkest parts of humanity. There are bits of backstory we get from Vincent that might inform how he became the way he is, an abusive father and troubled childhood, but honestly, his justifications show someone who is just broken and evil. The bodies he leaves in his wake throughout the night and his complete disregard for anything other than finishing his work shows a villain at their most horrific. In true noir fashion, Vincent fulfills his own prophecy. After a shootout with Max on an empty train, he's fatally wounded. There's no lashing out against death, just a quiet resignation as he walks to a seat and slumps down to sit. Max sits across from him, and Vincent can't help but attack one more time. But he doesn't try to hit him or fumble with another clip for his pistol. He simply looks across the train car and asks Max if he thinks anyone will notice. Tom Cruise's performance here is pretty unparalleled. It'd be easy to play this scene up, but he doesn't. He stays restrained, calm, and collected. What makes Vincent's dying question so scary is Max doesn't answer. Not after a night where his reality was shattered into pieces, each splinter reflecting a part of himself, the city, and humanity he never knew existed. Vincent's power and terror doesn't rest solely in his aptitude with guns and violence, it's also in his powers of manipulation, his ability to inspire envy and jealousy to the point of breaking a spirit. And that is the magic trick that only someone like Cruise could bring to life while still coming across as endearing. The performance is so powerful. It's a wonder he hasn't attempted a similar role since. Maybe there's a justification there we don't realize. Cruise has always aired on more heroic and uplifting roles. That could just be the legacy he wants to leave, not one shrouded in moral ambiguity and dark shadows. But the terror he portrayed as Vincent is an idea that continues to haunt us. Despite what Vincent says, the world is more connected than ever. And as that connection grows tighter, the poisonous ideas he represents are never further away than our pants pockets or desks. And while the ideas might not be what breaks us, their vitriol and embittered malice could.
You're sheltering enemies of the state, are you not?
Yes.
You're sheltering them underneath your floorboards, aren't you?
Yes.
Point out to me the areas where they're hiding.
This is the opening scene of Inglourious Basterds, and it is, well, relatively terrifying. What starts out as a sunny day on a French dairy farm quickly devolves into a paranoia-drenched life or death interrogation, culminating with the brutal murder of a hidden Jewish family. Tarantino is a master of using intriguing and almost musical dialogue to drive tension. This works in part because Tarantino is a perfectionist. Brad Pitt went as far to say after filming Inglourious Basterds that Tarantino's set places him as God, and there is no blasphemy. Perfectionism can be a blessing and a curse when it comes to filmmaking, for sure. Sometimes perfectionism can lead to a film's budget ballooning from delays and reshoots, but on the other hand, a director who believes in his project and his writing so much as to settle for nothing less than his vision can result in pretty amazing pieces of cinema, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. The sixth film in Tarantino canon was almost scrapped entirely for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons was that the script had leaked online a few years prior to release, but another huge reason was that Tarantino was having trouble finding an actor who could deliver the performance necessary to make Hans Landa work. For a while, it was actually Leonardo DiCaprio who was in line to play the film's primary antagonist. For all intents and purposes, DiCaprio would have probably been relatively fine. He's fluent in German and could certainly deliver a powerful performance, but Tarantino is, again, a perfectionist. The performance was going to be absolutely perfect or the film wasn't going to happen at all, and Tarantino has even gone on record as to say that he thought that the character might be unplayable. A day before he was about to scrap the project entirely, he met Christoph Waltz and was gobsmacked with the perfection and ease with which he approached the character. He was actually instructed to hold back his performance during rehearsals. Tarantino didn't want the cast to know how good he actually was, so he instructed Waltz to give everyone a 6 instead of a 10 during that process. Waltz was told that if he felt actors begin to get competitive with him, that he was to lose. And in turn, the only actor who actually got to see a full-blown, full-effort performance during pre-production was Denis Ménochet, who played Pierre Lapardie in the film's opening sequence. The decision to hold Waltz back was made so that the actors would have a more authentic reaction to this, well, one-of-a-kind performance. This scene in general is incredibly well written. It tells a complete story that could almost act as a standalone short film in 19 minutes. It opens on Lapardie chopping firewood on top of a hill. There is this rhythmic quality to which these chops take place. Each one of these axe chops are about 1 second apart. This is important because it sets a cadence. We begin the scene with the sound of what is essentially a ticking clock, as the camera pans to a small fleet of German troops approaching this farm. When Hans arrives, we know there is trouble afoot. His uniform alone could tell you that, but the confidence with which he enters the room gives us the feeling of a python entering a hamster cage. The contrasting stature of these actors tells you all you need to know immediately. Despite the fact that this farmer could undoubtedly kill Hans very easily by hand if he so desired, Hans still sort of floats through the room as if he owns the place, while everyone else around him is trying to contain sheer and utter terror. It's all subtle and all oh so intimidating. Now, Waltz himself could write a book on how to be threatening and charming at the same time, and Hans seems as cordial and polite as any house guest could possibly be, but it's the lack of warmth and pleasantry shown against this sort of overt politeness that really send a threatening message to the viewer. And this is again done not through Waltz alone, but also through the writing. He pauses a little longer than usual. He holds eye contact for just a second too long, and Tarantino directs a performance that has that cadence we already discussed.
Monsieur, à votre famille et à vos vaches, je dis bravo.
And inversely, the Lapardie family can't and doesn't look at Hans for more than a brief moment. One of the first things Hans does upon entering the home is request a glass of milk. It's not an unusual request, after all, this is a dairy farm, but by doing this, Hans puts himself in this position of status. He's letting the family know that they are there to serve him in this moment. After excusing the family and reaffirming a spirit of trust by bringing up the fact that he left his soldiers outside, Hans and Pierre can finally get down to brass tacks. We at this point have no idea what exactly is going on. We just know that this family is likely in danger. This is usually the case when you have a period piece set in World War II and Germans are involved. But Pierre is particularly on edge about something that we haven't quite been able to comprehend yet. The request to switch to the English language might come off as pandering to an American audience, and by all means, it may very well be. However, Tarantino spins this later on in a somewhat brilliant way, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Hans quickly asserts his dominance over the entire situation by forcing Pierre to acknowledge that he knows who Hans is by reputation alone.
Please tell me what you've heard.
I've heard that the Führer has put you in charge of rounding up the Jews left in France.
The Führer couldn't have said it better himself.
This is a signal of submission to his authority, and again, it is done through this wolf in sheep's clothing, utterly disarming niceness. Once the power dynamic has been established, Pierre quickly shifts to more of a bartering phase, and out of nervousness, goes for his pipe to calm his nerves. After some light reassurances that this is just a doubling of efforts in the spirit of thoroughness, Hans brings up one specific Jewish family that has been left unaccounted for, while very carefully making Pierre explain in detail what he remembers about the missing family. Names, ages, descriptions, we think he's just getting information, but Hans is really interrogating Pierre. And Pierre's giving away everything he knows as the camera slowly pans around the table. Tarantino's way of telling us that literally and figuratively the tables have, in fact, turned. We get the full picture as the camera pans down under the floorboards and we see the aforementioned Jewish family huddled in a crawl space, hiding their breathing so as not to give away their secret. They're almost being crushed by the weight of what is transpiring above them. This is an eye-opening moment for the viewer as we now understand that an entire family's life is at stake, and the stakes of the situation in general are much graver than we initially anticipated. So after they wrap up the details, Hans asks for one final glass of milk. Making Pierre serve it to him is again just another psychological twist of the knife before making his final power play by forcing Pierre to call him by his nickname.
Did they call you the Jew Hunter?
Precisely.
From this point on, Hans plays out his winning hand one card at a time. He loves this moniker because he earned that moniker. Hans asks if he might be able to smoke his pipe, and boom. Almost comical as well, like a Looney Tunes gag. A way for Hans to insult Pierre before going in for the kill, and a message to Pierre that the game is over. Hans drops all the pleasantries and tells Pierre that he knows everything. The jig is up. Facial expressions shift into something more monstrous, and Hans tells Pierre that he not only knows that he is hiding Jews in his home, but that they are under the floorboards, exactly where we've seen them before. This is where Tarantino's stroke of brilliance with the languages comes into play. From a filmmaking standpoint, switching to English for this scene would likely ease producers' concerns of an American movie-going audience's ability to understand the film without being confused. But within the structure of this scene, Hans, knowing that the family was under the floorboard from the moment he walked into the room, we now know he switched to English so that they couldn't understand what was happening when Pierre was forced to give them up. Hans resumes his ruse, and the family is murdered in the dirt they were hiding in. Shoshana running away is the final image we have in the scene, and Hans allows her to live. His final words feel like they are left unfinished.
Au revoir, Shoshana!
As if he was going to add, until we meet again. He doesn't care if she lives or dies because he views her as lesser, as a rodent, nothing more, nothing less. It just so happens, though, that this moment gives this rodent the resolve to lock every high-ranking German official in a crowded theater and burn them alive later in the film. This 19-minute opening scene of Inglourious Basterds is a masterpiece of not only storytelling and writing, but also acting. It should come as no surprise that Christoph Waltz won an Oscar for his performance in the film because he was able to capture a variety of different emotions, attitudes, and really personalities in ways that turn a human being who by all accounts in real life is very nice into something much more sinister and inhuman. This may not be a case of casting the right actor in the right role, it may very well be a case of casting the only actor who could conceivably play this role with any level of believability. The scene being a testament to how keeping that perfection in your sights without compromise can yield amazing results.